The first issue, as I said beforehand, is to talk about the distinction between prioritization and exclusion and discrimination, in which we recognize on the one hand that some measure of prioritization is essential. We do it with our children, family members. An immediate sphere which is not perceived as imagined is a sphere that we believe has moral weight. Family demands something. Family entails having each other's back. Family entails prioritizing their needs. And we do that all the time. That is a core expression of our deepest moral intuitions, involves our responsibilities to family. But in fact, this issue of prioritization is at the heart, not merely descriptively of every social structure, but of our core moral intuitions as to its legitimacy and what is correct or incorrect to do. So, for example, in the United States, there is a discourse about universal health coverage. Should we have universal health coverage, or should you not? But the truth is, it's not universal health coverage. There is, in fact, not a single country in the world, nation, state, or not, which advocates for universal health coverage. If this sounds surprising to you, it's because you're forgetting what universal means. Universal health coverage is not a global category. It's universal coverage for those who are citizens of your country. There's not a single country in the world, nationalist or not, which doesn't perceive its primary moral responsibility to its citizens, to allocate its resources to its citizens. As Michael Walzer speaks about in Spheres of Justice, the purpose of community is a group of people who join together to distribute goods to each other. What it is that they define as good, and in accordance to what ultimate telos is a second question, but that's what we do. We distribute goods to each other in every one of our social structures. And in this, nationalism and nation states or the state of Israel are no different. Every country allocates resources for infrastructure, allocates resources for the education, for health, for jobs, security. To whom? To our citizens. And part of the challenge about nationalism is that we are disconnected from of our core essential moral intuitions. The prioritization, we all do. Let's take one of the more difficult issues. And I'm going to, and as you know all too well, you have not come here to Jerusalem to hear Donniel Hartman speak about your political realities, even though I want to. Just to get back at you. It's exhausting to think all the time is that all the problems are always here, but I won't and I'll hold back. But one of the first goods that every society distributes, every single social structure distributes, whether it is a family, a community, an organization, a country or a nation state, is the first good that we distribute to each other is the good of membership. And when we distribute membership, we determine who we give that membership to and who we don't, on the basis of a whole slew of criteria. Principally, who is going to be of benefit to the citizens of our country? What are our needs? Who's able to contribute? Who's able to carry their weight? And you might have complex notions. On the one hand, it might be, if you have $1 million, you get Canadian citizenship. Might be as crass as that. If you give enough cash, good. You're welcome. Might be more subtle. Who has certain jobs that our country needs? And everybody knows that one of the secrets behind Germany's policy towards refugees is the fact that it has almost no, because of a low birth rate, it is missing a whole slew of workers in a certain age class. Could be because culturally you're going to enhance our country. There is not a single country in the world which advocates for a complete and open membership policy. Now, you might accept a certain number of people who don't fit your criteria, but then again, you calculate what is that number that you can afford, something that, for example, Sweden did not do. What's the number that you can, in fact, strengthen your country, inculcate people into your country? But when the debate is between nationalism advocating for a membership policy, and since I'm not a nationalist, therefore I'm against a membership policy, is a stupidification of the discourse. Not only of the discourse. That's not a dividing line between Democrats and Republicans. As if membership issues just emerged under a Trump administration and not under President Obama, Clinton, and whoever, or McGovern and whoever it might be, or any country for that matter. Whether they advocate a liberal or they advocate a more individualist or they speak in the term of nationalism. The prioritization of your country's interests are the essential nature of what it means to be a member of a country. One of the most profound expressions, more radical expressions of that, is when you go to war. Now, with the exception of pacifists who are exempt in some instances, the act of defending your country in our moral instincts is actually noble. It's a sign of moral greatness, depth, commitment, loyalty. Not for every war, I'm going to come in a moment to that, but the essential act of protecting your country against attack from those on the outside entails a prioritization of your country's interests and of your country's life over those who you're going to meet in the battlefield. If all war is immoral, that's something else. But if we make a distinction between just and unjust war, then in our moral intuitions, just war entails an essential act of prioritization. Now, in each one of these cases, there's a very big difference between prioritization and discrimination. The last case is the most simple. It's when you fight for your country, right or wrong, or when by definition, any war that your country embarks upon is a just war. Then you've slipped from prioritization to discrimination. When you don't have a morality in war, you've slipped from prioritization to discrimination. And while I have a membership policy, every country, United States, Canada, Israel, to name just the three of the majority of us here, even if we have a membership policy, we are all signees on the Charter of Human Rights, on the Charter of Refugees, which says that even though I have a right to maintain a very, very careful and strict membership policy in accordance with what I and my citizens determine to be the interests, well-being, and purpose of my collective life, there are cases that have to be outside of those considerations. And I don't have a responsibility to give refugees citizenship, but I have to give them a right to reside in my country and to work and to be protected in the event that their life is threatened in their home country as a result of their political positions, perspectives, nationality, religion, race, or gender. Prioritization does not entail an essential act of discrimination as long as there's boundaries. I could have a membership policy and talk about at what point, if I invited somebody by closing my eyes into my country to do the jobs that I don't want to do, After what moment do I actually have a moral responsibility to them? That's a legitimate question, but that's not a question about getting rid of a membership policy. At what moment, if somebody, here in Israel, when somebody is born, there's X number of children of foreign workers are born here their whole life. At what moment, if you are born here, do I have greater responsibilities if this is the only world you know? And again here, quantity, quality, you could have that debate. I could have a membership policy and still be concerned as to what are we doing with children and with people around my borders? Where are we when I build those borders? The issue is not merely who's allowed in, but if you're not allowed in, do I take care of you? What are the consequences? I could have all of the above. I could speak about health care and infrastructure and educational and welfare and social security. Nobody's giving social security to a whole world. Social security will be there when I'm debating, do I start taking it at 67 or at 70? And now it's realistic because I don't know if it's going to be there at 70. So these are serious issues. But at the same time, every community ought to have some measure of foreign aid. Prioritization. If we come into contact with our core moral instincts, with the way we in fact function on an ongoing basis. The issue is not the legitimization of prioritization. In fact, almost none of us are globalists in that larger context. And as political philosophers point out, most globalists live in very, very stable and defined national communities. And the poster child, imagine, John Lennon tells us, that there are no countries, and there are no millionaires, and there is no, what is he called? I'm forgetting all the words, and there is no money or whatever it is. Not money, there is no. There was a whole slew. No countries, no religion, and no possessions. The multimillionaire, billionaire, who applies for U.S. residency, of course, and functions very well and says, this is where I want to live, because here is where I want to write my music and serve and raise my children. He didn't get citizenship. He was a permanent residency. He was allowed for citizenship, and it wasn't because of his looks. Countries make these choices. So he, within the context of a very stable environment, could afford to speak about globalism. That's not to say that globalism doesn't create serious challenges, but at the first stage, finding a way to talk about the legitimacy of prioritization is, I believe, critical for our political discourse as a people. And what I just did was a model, one that I was deeply moved, and I am continuously deeply moved by one of my intellectual teachers, Michael Sandel, who this is the way he does ethics. And I owe him gratitude and credit for that. Because it's not about sitting in a university or sitting in a room and trying to advocate for what constitutes, in your theory, the best model. But in fact, how do we live? We live with an ongoing process of legitimizing prioritization in the context of our state. But prioritization does not necessarily lead to exclusion and discrimination. Conceptually, this is what we do all the time. Some of us do it better, some of us do it worse. Some of us, our moral instincts get pulled differently. Some of us, it gets pulled at one number of refugees, someone at another one, someone have this perspective on war, other ones. Good people, decent people, smart people could all accept the legitimacy of prioritization and the illegitimacy of discrimination and disagree as to where it applies. That's what makes moral discussion valuable and debate valuable. But it's not a debate between prioritization, yes or no, but it's about which type of prioritization. And almost none of us, and it is really only when you disconnect from your core moral instincts that you begin often to advocate for positions that you yourself or your community itself would never imagine as even coherent. That's not to say that there aren't those who all posit that, but by and large, the core feature of prioritization is almost self-evident within our moral categorization. And so the question is, okay, it is legitimate, but why choose it in the first place? Why choose it in the first place? Why embrace this level of loyalty, commitment, and relationships? Why not? I know we perceive it to be legitimate, but why even embrace it in the first place? Here, we all have to tell ourselves different stories. And as a Jew, I want to tell a Jewish story. A story, as I said, of encumbredness. Now, we all know that whenever we come to tell a story within Judaism, we make choices. And mine is no different than anybody else's choices. But we also suffer or have to be very careful when we come to tell a story of encumbredness in particular, that this story is built on very, very particular gender presuppositions and power presuppositions. A Jewish story begins with notions of a very particular type of family, which is more limited than the broader language of family and relationships that many of us now embrace. It also assumes very clear power infrastructures, where males have the power and define the relationship of that encumbredness. But as rabbis, just like with nationalism, there are some who argue that the only way to move forward morally is to give up on the past because it is too encumbered by narratives that are unredeemable. I want to tell a Jewish story of encumbredness, but I want to, for today, bracket the family, gender, and power presuppositions that I know are at its core. Ones that I believe the core narrative still applies, even if I relinquish and reject those presuppositions. And so let's tell that story. And as you saw, the story begins in Genesis 1, where the first human being is unencumbered. The first human being is created alone. Male and female, Heshi is created, but they're created singular. What defines them is the fact that they were created in the image of God, and their job is to be godlike. In fact, their job is in all probability, according to Genesis 1, to replace God on earth. When God says, let's create someone in our image who will rule the world. Genesis 1 is an Ubermensch who lives alone and is a master of the universe. Humanity as we know it does not begin in Genesis 1. It begins in Genesis 2. And the biblical story does not follow Genesis 1. Genesis 1 is posited and, like always in our tradition, not rejected, but put as it's like the other side, to sit there, watch it, hear it. We learn some things about it, about the infinite value and equality of all humankind, because we were all created in the image of God. But the essential biblical story does not follow Genesis 1. Genesis 1 comes to an end. God has Shabbat and leaves the world, and then the biblical story begins. And it is Genesis 2 which is our story. And in Genesis 2, a human being is created alone. And that aloneness is seen as a problem. That aloneness is seen as a deficiency. And God's primary role after taking care of this human being, and we'll talk about that later, is to help this human being overcome their aloneness. And male and female, in their model, get created as the solution to human aloneness. And family begins. But the minute a second human being is created, the Bible says, Al ken yazov ish aviv et imo v'davak b'ishto. That the essential beginning is that this relationship entails being encumbered, tied to, loyal to, and in many ways also prioritizing them over others, who, by the way, don't yet exist, so the text is not fully coherent, but we'll leave that aside for now. Because they're both the first couple and the first parents, but we'll leave that for others to figure out what it means. But relationship means prioritizing one over the next. We are in that context of an encumbered family. We next encounter this sense of encumberness in Cain and Abel. When God turns to Cain and says, "Where is your brother?" assuming that you should know, and when Cain says, "Hashomer achi anochi," Cain is essentially rejecting this notion that I am my brother's keeper, and in so doing, fails the essential command of humankind at that moment. The Torah pre-Torah is a Torah of encumberdness. You are your brother's keeper. And when God decides to destroy the whole world, basically getting rid of any micro unit that might exist, humanity qua humanity is about to be destroyed, God says, v'noach matzachen b'nei Hashem. Noach does find favor. And then encumberdness continues. Because what is so fascinating is that God assumes that while Noach matzachen, that Noach finds favor, that it is Noach and his family who are going to go into the ark. There is no need to justify Noach's family. There is no need, and God, we already know, has the infinite capacity to do whatever God wants. But God recognizes that Noach is an encumbered being, and therefore saves the family. And then we start encountering our family, but with a twist. Abraham is the story, or tells the story, of the beginning of our encumberdness. God being encumbered to us being encumbered to God. But what's interesting about it is that the Bible takes pain to tell you that Abraham had a past and a family before him. Abraham's already going. His father doesn't play any role. And I'm not adding the rabbinic story. What do I care where he's schlepping and moving beforehand? Part of the Jewish encumberness, and this is going to create for us numerous challenges as we move forward, is that Jewish encumberness begins by breaking your encumberness to your past. Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladetcha mibet avicha. Reject terach. Reject your past. V'ascha legoy gadol v'avarchecha. And I will create a new encumberness with your children. But here too it's interesting. Sarah remains, or Sarai remains. So while in this story, the Jewish story begins built on this core notion of humankind as connected and bound to spouses, to children, involves both a continuation of that idea and its rejection at the same time. That there is a new family being created, which then also gets experienced in ultimately later on in conversion itself. To what extent are you still bound? Are you still your children, your parents' children? But then, as we move from a family to a people, and we are told that our people is an extended family, we are not merely encumbered by another individual, we become encumbered by a story. Genesis is not merely the genealogy of Jews. Genesis is beginning to talk about us as a family, and it tells us our story. And just telling you that story, obligating you to study it, obligating you to remember it, obligating you to become a storyteller, and that's what Pesach is, where you have to begin to tell your people's story. We are now encumbered by a story of a shared past. And that past defines us. And I am guided by it. And as you know, one of the more interesting things about the story is that there is no attempt to beautify it. And there is no attempt to make it a nice story. Because the significance of your story does not grow from the moral lesson that you can learn from it, but rather from the mere fact that it is yours. And even if yours is a mediocre story, it's just yours. Embrace your past. To be encumbered is not merely to enter into a loyal relationship with somebody, and this is one of the foundations, but it is also to see your identity in that context, and in that context you have your stories. And in that context of encumberness, you also have your symbols, which in our tradition are completely male at that moment. Circumcision. That's the sign of the covenant. You are encumbered by God and all fellow citizens. And the first time the category appears, from the Am that doesn't even yet exist. We have our story. And as we exit Genesis and move into Exodus, we're not told anything about our family, with the exception of 3 individuals. Shifra, Puah, and Moses, where the sole defining characteristic of each one of them is that they move their sense of encumberdness from spouse to children to all those who are members of their people. Shifra and Puah stand up for anybody and endanger their lives for their children. And Moses is characterized as the individual who doesn't have to, but he goes out to his people. That's all we know. We know nothing else about them. And then we are commanded to tell that story. Now, not only are we commanded to tell a story and to become storytellers of encumberdness, we also translate that sense of encumberdness into law. And let's turn for a moment to Leviticus 19 and its remarkable dance and use of categories. Page 12. And here we see where encumberness begins to shape your moral discourse, and one of the fundamental questions is, what does it entail? Lo telech rachil ba'amecha, lo tamod al dam re'echa, lo tisna et achicha bilvavcha, hocheach tochiach et amitecha, lo tikom velo titor et bnei amecha v'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. The core moral ethic of our tradition is an absolute rejection of Genesis 1. It is an ethic of your moral responsibilities to your community. That is not to say that you do not have moral responsibilities to others, but it means that as a Jew, I am talking about your story. I'm talking about your people. There might be other stories, but when I want to move you to moral responsibility, I am moving you to moral responsibility principally in the context of the nation or people within which you live. That doesn't mean that discrimination is allowed. It means that moral responsibility is founded within a context of a relationship that you have and the people who've told your stories. But then something even more remarkable happens. Ki agoritcha ger ba'artzecha lo tanu oto. I know about Amcha, I know about Reacha, I know about Achicha, I know about Bnei Amcha, but who is this ger? Already telling you that there's a difference between prioritization and discrimination. Between telling you, I want to talk about the rules that are going to govern your society. But that doesn't mean that the other disappears. I just want to talk about that. Because in the context of that encumberness, that your moral responsibilities grow. But here, what's so remarkable is that we not only see the sense of our encumberness to our people, but our encumberness to our story. You have to love the stranger. Ki gerim hayitem be'eretz Mitzrayim. And even in the loving of the stranger, it's the stranger ki yagur itcha ger. It's your stranger. But to be a Jew is also to be encumbered by your past. And your past, the story that I have challenged you and obligated you to tell, is a story which requires of you responsibilities not only exclusively to those who are members of your family, but those who share with you any sense of delegitimization, ostracization, and xenophobia. And so to be a Jew, in essence, gets translated in this context into the classic statement of Moses to Reuven and Gad, "Hachechem yetzu lemilchama v'atem tisharu po." You are encumbered, but that encumberness has multiple consequences. But then we come to the challenge. The Babylonian Talmud, Baba Metzia, and Masechet Gittin, page 20 and 22. Im kesef telaveh et ami, et ha'ani imach. Ami v'nochri, ami kodem. Ani v'ashir, ani kodem. Aniyecha v'aniyei recha, aniyecha kodmim. Aniyei recha v'aniyei ir acheret, aniyei recha kodmim. Some of it is simple, smart, intelligent. Don't do tikkun olam if your neighborhood stinks. Don't go and solve all the problems of the world if you're allowing discrimination in your backyard. Start with being encumbered by those who are closest to you. But then also, does that encumberness, or it does, that encumberness by definition does entail some sense of prioritization between aniyecha and nochri. Part of the ethic and story of the Bible leads exactly here. And it is one thing to say this in the context of an idolatrous universe which you see as your enemy. And I could understand it in a certain context. It is another thing to see this law and say, does this apply to the state of Israel? Does this apply not when I am a minority being attacked by people who want to destroy me and say, yes, care about your own, don't care about your enemy? What happens when you're building a society with fellow citizens in which there are other national groups in your midst? And we're going to talk about this more deeply and comprehensively when we study the Israeli nation-state law next Thursday. But you break this sense of prioritization in Gittin using the concept of Darkei Shalom. Yes, you can support. You're not merely to prioritize your sense of responsibility to your own. They are also to be supported together with you, but for Darkei Shalom. So when you support them, are you supporting them or are supporting you? Is Darkei Shalom a merely utilitarian language in which you recognize that as a minority, it's in your interest to do so? And therefore, supporting others is not an expression of transcending encumberedness, but becomes an expression of that type of encumberedness. Or does it, as we will see. And so as a Jew, the biblical story that I was raised on, the story of the perspective of what it means to be a human being, is to be connected, to prioritize, to be not merely in relationship with, but to be encumbered by. I am Shomer Achi, And im achai yotzim lemilchama, I'm not supposed to sit here. I am encumbered by a past. I am told that my community begins with the family. And then I'm given the stories of my family. And then told to build my moral responsibilities to that family and to that past, or through that past. But because that's the story that I have, that story, as we see, can begin to dance along the line or open the door to fascist instincts. Is Jewish nationalism particularly dangerous? Now, you could argue, and many do, that therefore Jewish nationalism, as distinct from other nationalism, or other forms of membership, or other forms of relationship, are far more morally superior. And that might be the case. But I want to argue that the essential question is not nationalism, some form of communitarianism, individualism, or globalism. Nationalism is susceptible to fascism no less than globalism. The essential question that we have to add to the equation is if nationalism entails the prioritization of your interests, we actually have to talk about those interests. And it is only if we have a more nuanced discourse as to what it means to pursue my people's interests do I have an ability to ask whether nationalism is redeemable or not. How do we understand interests? And here too I want to tell you a story. Here too I want to give a 10,000 feet high perspective on the different ways that our tradition speaks about interest. The first, and through those lenses, to try to understand what's the telos of my community. Here, I am encumbered for what? What is it that my encumberness is supposed to guide me towards? What does it mean to live in a Jewish society? What are the interests that I'm supposed to prioritize? And does that notion of interest inherently entail moral challenges along the lines of who am I allowed to help and who am I not allowed to help? Who's in and who's out? It's not inherent to nationalism, but I would argue it's actually inherent to your theory of interests. And in the theory of interests, our tradition tells multiple, but I want to focus on 3 dimensions. The first and most surprising, as I said beforehand, is the remarkably physical nature of the way Judaism defines happiness and the end of human life, the purpose of human life. Again, Adam 1 has no happiness. Adam 1 just has a mission, because God doesn't have happiness, and Adam 1 is God, or God-like. But in Adam 2, in Genesis 2, we are immediately exposed to a vision of the world as it ought to be, of God's role in the world and our role as humans. God is not merely the creator of the world, but as we see, God creates for us a Garden of Eden and places us there and puts in that garden not a beit medrash. He puts in that garden everything that is beautiful to see and delicious to eat. The Garden of Eden is a complete and total embracing of the legitimacy of the physical existence of humankind. To leave the garden is to live in a world of scarcity, to live in a world where everything that you need is painful. To be in the garden is to be in a world where everything that you want is provided for you. God provides it, as when God's role is to be the provider of physical happiness, and humans, if you live with God, are granted that gift of physical happiness. And even though human beings are exiled from the garden, so-called banished for all eternity, in fact, the whole Bible is about returning to and recreating for God chosen people a Garden of Eden wherever they live. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, while having profound challenges and travails or trials, essentially are living out the divine promise of Lech lecha me'artzecha mimoladcha mibet avicha la'aretz asher ereka ve'avarchecha, and I will bless you. They lived charmed, blessed lives in which everything that they need, from food to sustenance to security, is guaranteed. Even if Abraham goes down to Egypt, the blessing goes with him. Even if he's confronting a Pharaoh, the blessing comes to him. Even in Egypt, he gets a Garden of Eden. And when the Jewish people are redeemed from Egypt, in the narrative of our tradition, the redemption from Egypt is a redemption into a Garden of Eden. First, the miracle of the desert, which is in theory the antithesis of the garden, a garden where everything grows, a garden which is fed by its own river so bountiful that it gets divided into the 4 great rivers of the Far East, a place where everything, which makes Egypt seem infertile. You're in a desert where nothing grows. And the whole biblical story is about the desert becoming where the real blooming of the desert is not Zionism. It's God and the exodus from Egypt, where instead of growing produce from the ground up, it is produced from the heavens in the form of manna or quail. And where water is found and brought out through rocks and purified through magic branches. And when we leave, and as God speaks, and in the book of Deuteronomy, as you saw, when they look and ask, what is this? Nothing was lacking from you. Even your clothing and your shoes were immune from wear and tear. The miracle of the exodus from Egypt is that you go to a Garden of Eden in the desert. Even when you get the Torah, it's not the spiritual moment, it is a completely physical garden. And when you leave your Garden of Eden in the desert and go to the land of Israel, you get a second garden. A land, the promised land, is a land that's defined as a land of milk and honey. And in the Messianic era, the aspiration, when we are again banished from the Garden of Eden, our aspiration is to return to that garden, and as Eicha says, Chadesh Yameinu Kekedem. It's to return to that promise. And as you saw in the rabbis, as we continue our messianic aspirations, it continues the same notion of the garden, where, imagine if this is in fact redemption. Women will give birth every day. Trees will bear fruit in new cycles every day. And the ground will create cakes and clothing. The place of the physical within our tradition in defining the ultimate purpose of human life is remarkable. Now, that is not to say that this notion is utilitarian in the classic Benthamian sense, in which the good is defined as the pursuit of happiness, or rather, the maximization of happiness for the maximum number of people. In our tradition, the good is ascribed to walking in the way of God, whether walking in the way of God might be doing just and right, or walking in the way of God, as in Lech Lecha, is just doing whatever God demands of you. But the consequence of this walking is pure physical maximization of happiness. And in many ways, the strength of our tradition is that it does not require of you, and for some this is a weakness, it doesn't require of you a Buddhist move to understand that all is nothingness and nothingness is all, but rather that this world that God created and said is very good is actually legitimizing the pursuit of physical happiness. And this is extremely important in the context of modern states or nation states. Because one of the core foundations and aspirations of every nation is the distribution of good to its citizens. And it's the feeling that I am looking out for your well-being. The essential aspiration of Zionism is to allow Jews to return to their bodies, to allow Jews who felt that nobody saw them, I was transparent, nobody cared about me. I am now going to be home in a place where someone's going to see me, where my blood is not hefker, where my blood counts. Jewish lives matter might be the core slogan of Zionism. In a context of a world where Jews felt that nobody felt that my life matters. And that my first and foremost obligation is to connect to this old ancient Jewish tradition, and therefore the so-called revolution of Zionism or its rejection of classical. No, it's a return. And Israel is supposed to be the Garden of Eden for the Jewish people after the exile from hell. But the connection and the correlation between this physical notion of happiness with how you achieve it actually produces the second layer, and that is the notion of expanding happiness beyond the physical, also to the spiritual, also to the intellectual, also to a life of value. And this idea is already planted in the Garden of Eden, in the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Trees that we're not supposed to eat. From the beginning, our access to the God who provides physical well-being is contingent and continues to be contingent on your behavior. Why that is the reward could be surprising in a spiritual context and aggravates someone like Maimonides to no end, causing basically the essential interpretive move of Maimonides to how do I overcome this distorted notion of humanity? That the Bible, how do I free myself from this biblical tradition? But by associating the two, and as here says, that the tree of knowledge and good and evil is planted so that you will determine the good, not on the basis of what you see as good, but you will determine the good on the basis of what God challenges you to define as the good, creates at least the possibility that if to attain physical well-being, happiness, and security, I have to embrace a different notion of good, it at least opens up the door to a different notion of what happiness means, in which happiness does not merely mean the acquiring of more stuff, the acquiring of more trees, more land, more water, more resources, but rather living a life of value. And whether that value is ethics, whether that value is like Maimonides, to walk in the way of God is to pursue the truth, or it's an Aristotelian notion that happiness is to act in a rational manner, the notion of being commanded. The fact that the Bible is not a hedonistic book which challenges of you to go from one drunken party to the next. And here Job is so interesting, where whenever his kids would have a party, he'd be frightened that 1 second, is this defining you? Could you lose it? That expansion creates the possibility in our tradition to ask, is there more to happiness than just a bigger Garden of Eden? And as we see, and as you saw in Isaiah, in some of the prophetic messianic aspirations, It's not simply to return to Israel. It's not simply to be victorious over our enemies, which is the dominant narrative of messianic theory in prophetic literature. But it's also that there will be a time where the earth will be filled with the knowledge of God, and all people will come forth and want to go to the house of the mountain of God. That the end of days is not just more physical happiness, but a transformation in the values and spiritual dimensions that we bring to our discourse. And so while the bracha and klala of the Bible is completely physical, observe and you're in a Garden of Eden. Don't observe and you're outside of the Garden of Eden. The notion of being commanded, Vaitem li mamlechet kohanim v'goy kadosh, opens up parameters to another level of discourse. And the reason why this level is so critical is that the first seems to always create a zero-sum game between you and others, in particular your neighbors. Because if the telos of my community, if the pursuit of my interest, if my definition of my interest is purely physical, then I never have enough. Who wins? Who has more? And if my job is to maximize that, I always want more. When do you have enough, especially in a world of scarcity? And I'm always in a competition with my neighbors over who has control over which resources. But it is only when I begin to add a second dimension which asks, happiness is not just more, but it is also what? Then it's possible that the pursuit of more could undermine my pursuit of what? Let's take the example of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If the goal of Israel is to ensure my safety and security, that Israel is where Jewish blood counts, and its primary responsibility is to maximize physical happiness, the minute I do not believe that peace is possible, or the minute I do not believe that it is simple, I will naturally inclined to a position which says, why should I take a risk? Why should I worry about Palestinian needs? My job is to worry. My job of my country is to worry about my needs first. And any discourse of territorial compromise, concessions, not to speak of any peace move, would be antithetical to Zionism, seen as a betrayal to your being encumbered. You're supposed to look after your interests, but if my interests are only physical, then my job is to reject anything that endangers. But the minute I ask, is there another definition of happiness? Then there's room for another conversation. And then all of a sudden, is Israel as a democratic country part of my definition of the interests of this country? Now, how do you balance the two is a separate question. But the presence of both challenges you to not merely think in physical happiness terms, but to ask more than that. And to conclude, we come to the third stage. When Micha states, Ma Elohim doresh mimtach, never mind. God bless you. Hagid lecha adam ma tov u'ma Adonai doresh mimcha ki im asot mishpat v'avad chesed v'atznei alechet im Elohecha. Micha, I believe, is asking, or at least positing, is there something beyond happiness as the core defining feature of what it means to be a human being? And that following the will of God is not merely a question of what reward you would get, but the worship out of love is to worship because this is the ultimate telos. When Maimonides says that Mefarnesim Aniyei Akum Im Aniyei Yisrael Mishum Darkei Shalom, because darchei darchei shalom v'chol netivotei shalom, is he merely expanding the parameters of happiness to a life of value? Or is he saying that maybe self-interest and the pursuing of your particular interests, whether physical or spiritual, is not the primary defining characteristic that must determine the way the decisions you make and the policies you embrace? Maybe it's just doing the good because that's what it means to be a Jew. No other goal entailed. And as you saw in source 48, or did not see in source 48, there's very many versions of the trolley story. This is a Jewish version of the trolley dilemma. Trolley dilemma of multiple forms. One form is I'm a driver of a trolley and I have 100 people on my trolley. And I'm informed that the track on which I'm driving right now is broken. And if I stay on that track, everybody's going to die, but I could veer to another track. The problem is on that track, there's a car stuck. There's a baby, makes it harder. There's somebody. What do? Do I save the 100 or do I kill the one? In utilitarian theory, it's simple. You maximize happiness for the maximum number of people. And for many of us, those are core decisions. And by the way, very often, those are decisions that we also make on an ongoing basis all the time. But in our tradition, if somebody is told, give us one and we're going to save all of you, give us one woman to be raped, give us one man to kill, you're supposed to choose death. The Jewish tradition has the chutzpah to also say, who said that maximizing happiness is the only value? Who said that happiness and that interests, your interests, and the pursuing of them is what must define your individual and collective life? And when Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says, Shalosh matanot tovot natan HaKadosh Baruch Hu liYisrael, Torah, Eretz Yisrael, Torah, v'olam haba, v'chulam lo nitnu ela im yisurim. There are three gifts that God gave to the Jewish people: Torah, the land of Israel, and the world to come, and every one of them was given with suffering. Yochanan ben Shimon Bar Yochai, living post-destruction, living in a world in which Jews are living under the occupation of Hadrian and are living with profound, profound persecution, looks at the Bible and says, who said that God's role is to maximize my happiness? And who said that to be a Jew is to get access to that happiness? Who said that that's the covenant? That's not the covenant. The covenant entails suffering. And happiness does not define Jewish life. And its pursuit and the maximization of it doesn't define all that we are. The covenant involves the acquisition of things of value, but knowing fully well that they will always entail suffering. That's not to say that suffering is necessarily an end unto itself, but that suffering is an essential part. Pain, suffering, death. It's an essential part of our story. And if you want to live a life of value, it's not simply by expanding happiness, but by giving up its claim. Giving up its claim. In a certain sense, as Kohelet says, ki hakol havel. And when Maimonides in Ilchot Talmud Torah so beautifully says, Lo yasim al libo sheikne Torah im haosher v'hakavod ka'achat, on page 42. Kach hi darka shel Torah, pat b'melach tochal, umayim b'mesorah tishteh, v'al haaretz tishan, v'chayetzar tichyeh, u'b'torah ata'amel. Who said interests are happiness? Now here the political significance, and with this I'll conclude, become even more important. And the ultimate question, I don't care whether you're a nationalist or whether you're a globalist or whether you're an individualist, when you're pursuing interests, the critical question between particularism or showing preference to and discrimination is going to end up with how you define your interests. When it is purely physical, the test is very challenging, because I always need more and I never have enough, and why should you have access to it? Who do you love? When that's all that's there, who do you love? And when citizens feel that in their society they're not loved, that's precisely when radical nationalism grows. When they don't feel that their society sees them and cares for them. When they feel that our society doesn't care about me, then all of a sudden it's me or them. Who do you love? Do you love the Jews? Maybe I love the Jews. But maybe my obligation to those interests are different. This again meets where these issues of nationalism and moral responsibility are most acute in moments of war, where it literally is your life or theirs. And it's here that Israel's code of ethic comes forth again, which says that you're only allowed to use your military power, your force, only in self-defense, only in proportion to the danger that you face, and do everything in your power to prevent casualties to civilians and to prisoners of war. Israeli military code of ethic declares that happiness is not the only thing that must guide us and walk with us into battle. And doing everything in our power sometimes also means that the job of our army is not to bring every soldier back alive, but to also ensure that every soldier of us does not cross a moral line, even if it sometimes means minimizing happiness. So what is the story of nationalism? Our tradition says never belittle the physical, because if you do, you're unhealthy. If you do, you're going to unleash far more radical forces. The physical is essential, and that is Zionism. But happiness must also entail some notion of the good. And I would argue that any nation state or any community or any ideology which only holds on to happiness as a goal and doesn't recognize that an inherent part of its life is going to include suffering and death and pain, is going to have within it a cancer which is going to lead to discrimination, whether it's globalist, individualist, or nationalist. Israel, Zionism, Jewish nationalism could be redeemed when the three speak to you and challenge you. When it is never, and this is our classic, in our tradition, if someone asks you, is it A, B, or C, the answer must always be yes. Now again, as I said at the beginning, and this is indeed my last sentence, or it's two. Good people, smart people, decent people, caring people could take all three categories and develop different policies. Our challenge, the challenge of nationalism that I want you to think about throughout this seminar, is whether it is redeemable, whether it is worth the risks, whether you could free yourself from it, and whether, more importantly, we can create a discourse that could reflect the best of who we are. And the best of who we are is not embracing death. The best of who we are is embracing a dance between physical happiness, moral, spiritual happiness, and a rejection of happiness. When the three merge together, particularism, Jewish nationalism, or any ism has the potential of being a force for good. Thank you. And now it's your turn. Questions, comments? Yes, please. You know what I'm going to do? Because I see the time. I'm going to take a batch of 3 together. Could I see 3 from this side? 1, 2. Just 1 second. I just want to make sure we have gender diversification in our questions because men raise their hands quicker than women. So take a breath for a second. I have 1, 2. It's okay. I have patience. I'm stiff-necked. I will wait for you. I'm going to start with these 2 because this is very, very critical for our creating a discussion amongst everybody. Yes, please, sir. No, it'll be too long, and I'll repeat the question, and this way I could also change what it is if I need to. I'm not joking.
Text 48 you said was a Jewish version of the trolley problem. Can you explain why? Because I didn't see that.
Okay, second question.
What other words did you...
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, yourself, please. Okay, I'll let the 3. Yes, please.
I wanted to ask you to speak to the connection between encumbredness and indebtedness, because that's an interesting category.
Very nice. Yes.
I think the connection is responsibility, but you answer.
Very good. Yes, please. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Yes.
I'm also curious about other words that you considered for encumbredness along the way, given that it's a new word.
Great. Does anybody take up my challenge on this left side of the community? Not for now. I'm hoping that the right side. Yes, please, ma'am.
Yes. I thought I heard you making an equivalence between peoplehood, or what the French call une nation, or what we would call Am Israel, and the notion of a political nation-state or political nationalism. That seemed like an easy allusion to.
Great. Thank you very much. First, encumbredness. I intentionally picked that term. Number 1, I got it from Michael Sandel, and I intentionally picked it in the hope that some people wouldn't like it. Not because I want to aggravate people, even though it doesn't bother me to do so. But it's not an end unto itself. But part of our agenda here is about using words that others will pick other words and get over it. Not you yourself. I'm not saying you did. I'm not saying, chas v'shalom, I'm not, no. But I'm saying intentionally. Go to the concept, not to the word. You have another word? Knock yourself out. Use it. This is my word. I'm using it. I like it. You don't like it? I don't care. You don't need to use it, is the point. That's the whole process of our discourse is about each one of us taking ideas and finding the language and not allowing language to serve as a barrier. And precisely if this word served as a barrier, I achieved one of my goals. I manipulated you. So, and I considered multiple other ones, but for me, this speaks to me very, very deeply. I was raised as an encumbered being. At the age of 3, my father told me, Donniel, you're responsible. And that's the way I've walked throughout my life. I didn't always act that way because I was an idiot, ADHD, lots of other things. But that idea, for me, that's essential. My father was an encumbered, you saw him, the weight, he felt that weight. And so I come from a school where encumbredness is beautiful. You don't like the word? Any word you want, take. It's for you. Who cares? So that's one. A take on 48. I hope I gave you the right source. Yeah. No. Oh, I'm sorry. I meant 53. 53. If you didn't get to it, it's Laws of the Foundation. 53. So that's an easy answer. Study 53. On the category on compare encumberness with indebtedness. They have a lot in common, not the same. I could be encumbered by people who I'm not indebted to. So there is a dimension, but even though indebtedness is a form of encumbredness, but I could also be encumbered. So they could be synonymous. I love the sense of duty of encumbrance. So that's why I pick it, but please continue to play with them. And you're in absolutely the right direction. And
Chicken and egg,
It could absolutely be, and there is a very deep sense that when you share a story, you also share indebtedness, and that's another. It's another one. Which one? I think there's slight differences, but they might not be that significant. And you're absolutely correct. Peoplehood does not essentially entail nationalism. And as Yehuda, and as we're going to talk about here very deeply, I could be committed to Jewish peoplehood without being committed to Israel. In fact, I could argue that one of the things undermining Jewish peoplehood is Israel itself. That argument is made increasingly, and it has validity, especially if Israelis believe that that Jewish peoplehood stops at the borders of Israel unless you're dying. So that is you are absolutely correct in calling me on that, and thank you for it, and I hope to get away with it, but your question was good. Because for now, for me, nationalism is an extension of people. For me, it's an expression of it. And it's an expression of not merely peoplehood, the consequence of a narrative of encumbredness, of seeing your community and your story as, or if we go to the second part of the definition of nationalism, which I didn't read, and that is, it views the sovereign state as a morally legitimate and even possibly necessary political framework wherein member citizens distribute to each other goods and pursue, protect, and promulgate their identity, values, and culture. I see nationalism as a healthy, natural consequence of my encumbered story to a people, to a story, to a past, in which I discover my identity comes forth in that manner. My aspiration for world Jewry, what does Zionism mean, is not for people who say, I want to move to Israel, but that rather Jews in Israel and Jews in America and Canada and Mexico and wherever all Jews are from, that we see each other as having what to learn essentially from each other. But that even if I don't live in Israel, I see the state of Israel as an integral part of my Jewishness, not as an overseas allocation, but as a local need, because it provides another perspective on where I get my source of identity. How do I live within that larger world? I live within a particular sense and place. So I do make that extension, but you are absolutely right, and I am indebted to you for making that absolutely correct point. And part of our discourse over the next 10 days is about that interconnection. What do they mean and what do they not mean? And so thank you very much for that. I'm now going to go to the right-hand side. See, I'm going to take 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Those will be our 3 for now, okay? We made a major flaw. We moved this to here because I did it because I always teach at 11 o'clock in the morning. Absolutely, madame. Yes, please.
This may seem a little tangential, but it feels related. I'm fascinated by the fascination with ancestry research. And it seems to represent some deep yearning for a connection to family that isn't there for people. And I wonder where that comes from and how that plays into...
It's not tangential at all. Thank you. It's not tangential at all. And I'll share with you something that Michal Biton has taught me, and I am blessed to have great chevrutas, and she is one of them, and I'm going to share you something about that in a moment. There was there was one more hand here and in the back. I don't know who it was who I pointed to. Was it you, sir? Please.
So you described Zionism as being all about the well-being of the Jewish body. I wonder if you collapsed all of Zionism into on purpose, into political...
As distinct from cultural Zionism. Great question. Thank you.
As distinct from cultural, but even more so socialist Zionism.
Socialist Zionism. Great. Thank you very, very much. Excellent. Oh, this is such a machaya. Your questions are making my lecture better because I get a chance to correct what I said. Yes, please.
I think you said Leviticus 19 rejects Genesis 1.
Yes.
And could you explain that? And also, could you repeat what you said about the 4 rivers? Because I didn't get that.
Okay. The 4, I'll do the simpler one. If you just open up the Bible, you know, that there's this big river, and that river goes and waters everything and then goes into river 1, 2, 3, and 4. The big rivers, that's just right after the Garden of Eden.
No, but what was your
the Euphrates, etc. No, that this river is so powerful that this river in the garden is the source of water for the whole world in a certain sense. Like the antithesis of the desert. That was the less significant. That was just a minor will get put, okay?
But I'm confused because there's the garden, but then there's outside the garden.
Yes, outside of the garden are those rivers. They're not in the garden. Okay? We'll read it in general. We'll do that. Now, on the issue of, it's really interesting because we were taught, and this is what makes it's absolutely exhausting to learn anything anymore. But the reason why it's so exhausting is that every 15 minutes they tell you the new truth of where the world now is, right? What is the new, where, and this is where sociology and philosophy, they all intersect, and when the two are the same, the sociologists tell you this is what the world is. And now that's what it is. And then you always find yourself, I'm old all the time because everything's changing so quickly and I can't even catch up. And so now I learned that we're in a post-ethnic society. And I'm saying, oh my God, how is Judaism and Zionism going to work in a post-ethnic society? And Michal Biton says, Donniel, slowly. She says, we're not so post-ethnic. We all celebrated post-ethnicity. We're gone. There's no such thing as ethnicity. It's not significant anymore. And she says, Donniel, look at all this. Look, I'm going to use sociology to actually teach you something new. And what you're pointing to is actually people. There is a radical return to ethnicity. We're not living in a post-ethnic. Now, we might have multiple ethnicities. It might be a more complicated story. But the notion as if we've transcended this ethnicity belies the fact that there are a lot of people in America who not only do this, but who connect very deeply to their ethnic roots. And one of the interesting, because we didn't get into the category of the distinction between civic nationalism and ethnic nationalism. I don't know if you did any of your work or reading on that in preparation. It was in your readings, right? But in ethnic nationalism speaks about a national group connected with a narrative of shared origin, while civic nationalism speaks about the nation state as a collection of its citizens, regardless of their national origin, as if there are two. But in fact, what's so interesting is that almost all civic national communities become ethnic. Because over time, it is all those who are your citizens become, and it's ethnic doesn't mean, since it's all imagined anyway, it's just a story, we're not talking about genes here in a literal sense. But that in fact, how France has a problem with its immigration. France, which was the classic model as distinct from Germany of civic as distinct from ethnic nationalism, has a notion of Frenchness, which over time, civic national groups become ethnic national groups, even in America. Now, you might argue as to what constitutes this ethnic group. And what might constitute it? It might be constituted by people of multiple colors sharing a certain purpose. You tell a story with a shared past and a language, because ethnicity is not just genetic origin, it's about culture and language and multiple things. So this return, we're not in a post-ethnic, we're in a post-ethnic. The only thing, be careful, is someone's going to tell you soon we're in a post-ethnic, but don't worry and don't get upset about it, because right away it'll be post, and then you can stay exactly where you are. Now, as to the notion of Zionism, I very much appreciate it, because I didn't state it as accurately as I meant to, and therefore your question and comment is correct, and it gives me a chance. I thought, or what I had hoped to say, was that Zionism at its core embraces the notion of physical happiness, and that there's almost nobody within the Zionist conversation for whom that's not even the first. It was about, we first want to live before we ask the question of how we're going to live. And part of the health of Zionism, when it says, give me back my body, or that Jew, Hamahalech Baderech, the Jew who's walking along the way and sees a beautiful tree and says, Mayafeh ilan zo, and he's studying Torah, obviously, and the Mishnah says, Mitchayev men nafsho, he should be killed. The guy says, this is you nuts. I want to get rid of this emaciated relationship to the physical world that was forced upon us by living in the squished, persecuted context of a ghetto. And so it was about counting and physicality. But I hoped that the next two categories are also essential to Zionism. And if I didn't state that, and you're right, I didn't state it clearly enough, I appreciate it. Because Zionism is actually the embracing of all three, especially the first two, but also the third, and especially, by the way, in the early parts of the country, where the ethos of death, Tov Lamut Bar Dartseinu, was also in it, was part of it, and it's not for nothing that Zionists are so enraptured by the Akedah, because the Akedah is not a strange story for Zionists. This notion of having to give your son is what we all know that's the worst thing. It's when your kid goes, it's not you going to the army, that's easy. It's when your kid goes to the army, we all know it. And so initially there had to be an embracing of it. And so Zionism, but ultimately I'm prescribing a future discourse of nationalism. It's about the discussion between the three. And if I didn't say that accurately, I really appreciate that comment. Thank you. Now we're going to go to the next three. 1, 2, 3. Those three? Yes, please. Welcome back. Your Haredi background's coming through. I'm with you. It has all the place here in the world. I'm with you. What? It's all that, but it's land. I know. I'm going to come. Great. Thank you. Excellent question and comment. Very much appreciated. Who are the other two? Yes. Yes.
So you accepted the premise that Jewish people does not necessarily entail nationalism, and in fact that nationalism can even undermine the value of peoplehood. And so I said maybe that's so, but what about the reality where the state already exists? Can there be a serious Jewish peoplehood that dismisses the reality of a Jewish nation, good, bad, indifferent, that exists already?
So speaketh the former president of ARTSA. Love you. Yes. Good. That's an extra twist.
I'm most interested in the question of how we prevent the slide from nationalism to fascism. And I think that, as I was thinking about it, the pursuit of maximization of happiness, or physical happiness, spiritual happiness, or rejection of happiness, any of those could become fascist. And the dance between them, I think, is the secret idea of the hybrid. And then I also wonder about the hybrid between nationalism, individualism, and globalism. Isn't that also part of
Yes, great.
And isn't it maybe that fascism is about purity?
Yes,
And
great.
hybridity is actually itself the sacred.
Perfect. Great. Great three questions to end with, and it's real. I love you. No, being able to be with you, it's just great. Thank you. Your question is a hard one. Part of my goal of speaking about encumbredness is to wonder whether some of the rejection of nationalism is grounded on an alienation from core moral instincts that you actually have. Now, if you don't have them, that's okay. And it might be there, but the attack against Zionism as attack against encumbredness, I want to argue is an attack against something that is inherent within those people who attack it unto itself. That's part of what, part of the discourse. It is perfectly acceptable in this Beit Midrash, even though it's not acceptable as a policy of the Hartman Institute. The Hartman Institute is an unequivocal, unapologetic Zionist institution. That's what we do. We're here to part of our mission is to support Israel and to support the relationship of the Jewish people with Israel. I wake up in the morning with that as a given. But we are a pluralistic institution in which all ideas, including the ideas that I reject, are part of our conversation. More than that, it is precisely by hearing those ideas that there's a possibility for me to redeem nationalism from itself, because the fact is, as you beautifully state, Haredi could be a great corrective to nationalism. And one of the problems today is the Zionification of the Haredi community, is robbing Israel of one of its voices. And it could have been that if Israel had a much different attitude, we could have used Haredi. Here again, I go to the CCAR, and it's not comparing the two. But when the CCAR statement, what was it, in 1996, when it says that one of the unique challenges of Israel and world Jewry together is that we transcend nationalism all the while that we embrace it. That is most, like that, I go home. That's just that alone. Great. So that discourse. So I know that people are, could you have a love for the land? Could you have a love for Jewish people? Listen, that's going to be our conversation. And each one of us is going to come out different and find different ways. That's what we're about, trying to figure out this discussion. But what pains me is that when Zionism and Israel are attacked for embodying something that is embodied essentially all the time, but is only illegitimate when it comes to the context of Israel. And so modeling some of that is what I wanted to share with you. That doesn't mean I could convince people. And it's very possible that there's, just like is it a mitzvah to say that which will be heard, so is it a mitzvah not to say that which will not be heard. It could very well be that one of the challenges of the Jewish world is that we're over-obsessing about education in colleges. When in college you might be disconnected from certain core moral instincts because it is a sui generis existence. You're disconnected from your family, you don't have a family, you're literally, and then all of a sudden this is where we have to succeed. Maybe we just have to survive. Maybe we just have to survive that so that education could go back to, instead of redefining all of our discourse, to engage with now that's an interesting question which I don't know if I have an opinion about, but I'm thinking about. As to your question, I could have a relationship with Israel in the sense, and you're right, there is a difference between in theory and in practice. It's now here. It's here. But the challenge of Jewish peoplehood, of encumberness, is I could recognize that Israel's here. Okay, you're here. When you're dying, I'm there for you. Just like Israel. As groups of us we've studied, Israelis don't see you. But it doesn't mean they don't love you. They just don't like you. They don't like you. And so they love you. So when you're dying, they're there for you. So that's not enough for me, because it is coherent for numerous North American Jews to say, yes, okay, in theory I support Israel. To say that it's an integral part of my Jewishness, that I'm enriched by it, that I'm challenged by it, that I want to think about it, that I want to wonder about what does it mean to be connected to it in a place even though I'm at home in my own country? What is the nature of that? Do I have a dual loyalty? Is it wrong? Do I have a triple? All these questions. That goes beyond just saying Israel is. Because I could have an Israel is, just like other family members. I have a brother and I have a sister and I want to see you, next year. And it's just not, love you, mwah, see you Thanksgiving. And that's it. That's Jewish peoplehood wants more. That's why also I love encumberedness. I'm connected to you, and maybe your category not only of encumberedness but of indebtedness, interdependence. There's lots of. It's more than that. And so the fact that Israel doesn't mean I have to have a relationship with. And North American Jews could ask the same question as what's my relationship? France also is, and Italy is, and maybe it's a little different, but I want more. And you're right, an essential part of my argument is that it really is not about nationalism or globalism or individualism. And you're right, and I didn't state this, but that nationalists entail also that it's when it becomes an either or that each one, and if I'm a globalist, that I'm going to have to argue when I put it into a pure category. Life is not about these pure categories. And we put them into these pure categories in order to reject them, and then we're flattenizing and superficializing our discourse instead of complexifying it as we ought to be. And in a certain sense, it is absolutely correct, as we're going to study, that our tradition and our engagement with nationalism and peoplehood involves an embracing also of individualism and globalism, and it is about that dance. That's what it is all about. Now, in my defense of nationalism, or in my attempt to talk about it, what was the term you used? It's about the hybrid, correct. It is about allowing our loyalties to be hybridified. And when they are hybridified, they breathe. When they get out of their boxes, then we're not debating. Now we're actually coming to terms with our moral intuitions, because our moral intuitions aren't constructed behind a veil of ignorance in a university classroom in which I try to ascertain some Kantian notion of a categorical good, of how I would act. No. They're shaped by my stories. They're shaped by my past. They're shaped by my experiences. They're shaped by what I ate yesterday. They're shaped by my fears. I'm all of them, and it's only when you could connect to them that we can allow humanity. Morality is not defined with a computer program. Now, if we allow Israel and nationalism and Zionism to embrace that hybridity, if we don't look at the other and boxify them just so that we could reject them, just like we don't like to be boxified ourselves, then we could begin to learn, and then the categories could come to life. Welcome, and it was a pleasure being with you. Thank you very, very much.